Hey everyone, welcome to a special session about basically yoga philosophy. The title of this chat is called Finding You in Yoga, Y-O-U, as in you yourself. And this is a topic that's very near and dear to my heart, and it is a question that I have been asking myself since I can remember, since I was a little girl. And I'll get to what that question is exactly. But before I go there, I want to talk a little bit about the why of yoga. Why do we practice? And what it is, in essence, beyond the physical practice that we all know and love on our mat in our studio space, wherever your studio space is right now, whether it's virtual or if your studio is open or you're practicing from your living room floor. So I will share with you my screen because I think a visual for this particular topic is helpful. So great. So what I think is so cool, and what I remember learning actually back when I was a sophomore in high school, taking my first psychology class, and it was a class that really resonated with me. I loved the teacher. She was very passionate about what she was teaching, but I also was first introduced to Maslow's hierarchy of needs in this particular class. And what I found so profound about it was this psychologist who, to me, seemed like he was ahead of our time. Maslow was born in the early 1900s and continued his study of self-actualization, or his pyramid called the hierarchy of needs, into the 70s when he passed away. But so this particular pyramid that you're looking at on the left was popularized in the 50s, and he was particularly interested in high-functioning people, in human qualities that were positive, and people in particular that were living an exemplary life, not unlike the yogis that we still believe to be the ideal human beings that live a peaceful way, who we would like to exemplify in our daily lives. And so this pyramid that he created is based on that we all as human beings have these basic needs. We have to have these needs met in order to be a high-functioning individual, in order to be that pinnacle of success, which he called self-actualization. If you look at the pyramid on the left, you'll see that at the very top of this pyramid, self-actualization is there, along with all of these characteristics that he identified as being self-actualized. And so I was sitting in this sophomore high school class listening to my teacher talk about these hierarchy of needs, and it was kind of a light bulb moment for me. And in that moment, I remember thinking to myself, that is what I want. That is my goal. And as I continued on to college, that stuck with me. And I actually remember, this is such a side story, but I think it's relevant. I just like most people do throughout their life, I was experiencing well, maybe not most people, maybe I shouldn't say that, but I personally was experiencing a bout of depression. And so I was seeing a counselor, and I remember saying to my counselor, this is in college, she was like, well, what do you want? Like, what's your goal with me? And I said, my goal is to become self-actualized. And yes, maybe at that period of time, I was, 20, 21, and a little idealistic, perhaps a little bit innocent, you could say. But I knew still at the core of my being that that was my goal. And when I said this to her, she kind of laughed, and I was a little bit taken aback, because for a counselor to kind of laugh at a goal like that, even though it may seem highfalutin, felt like, wow, this woman isn't maybe this woman isn't in alignment with that. And so I knew right away that instead of rejecting that part of myself that wanted that for me to be my highest, to become my highest self, that it was this woman and I not really jiving together. So I was able to pivot and continue on my path. And that same year I found yoga. And what I realized when I found yoga and I started to study yoga is that the yoga system, which is ancient, about 5,000 years old, has the same kind of pyramid. Although it's not depicted as a pyramid, it is talked about as a chakra system, as a system that lives within the body, that the chakras are these very powerful centers of energy, these high frequency energy points in our body that are expressive of these characteristics and human needs. And very much like what Maslow was talking about, if they are not met, there is imbalance in the body, and it is by meeting these needs and acknowledging these human experiences that we have that we are able to live in alignment with ourselves, that we are able to achieve the goal of becoming self-actualized, which is, it's the same goal of yoga, although it's often said in a different way. You might hear self-realization or enlightenment, even nirvana, and in Sanskrit the yogis call that samadhi. So I'm going to bring you back to me for a minute, and I want to take just a minute to let that sink in. And I think it's important to acknowledge that on this path of yoga, which may feel like a very physical and surface, a gross body thing, not necessarily a subtle body thing, an energetic thing, depending on like how you came to find yoga and what style of yoga you resonate with, that there is an undercurrent, an all-encompassing theme to each of these yogas, and that is to achieve your highest self. And there are a lot of different pathways to get there, which we'll talk about. Yoga doesn't say that there is only one right way. It doesn't say that you have to do X, Y, and Z in order to achieve the goal of self-actualization. So, but one of the tools that we can help to find that connection with ourselves, because most importantly is really, it is a connection with ourselves, and it is an ability to look inward for the answers for ourselves, because it's the idea that no one else has those answers. Even this guru or even this teacher with thousands of hours of experience or all of these followers doesn't have the right answer for you, that you are the one that has the answer for yourself. And so one of the tools to find those answers for yourself is meditation, the ability to sit still with yourself and your body and to experience what happens when you do that. It's really hard for us. I think, speaking for myself personally, it's hard for me to do this. Oftentimes when I'm sitting still, there's a constant to-do list running in my head. There's planning for the future. And then more often than not lately, there's a lot of anxiety and stress that comes up. And this is not a sign that I am not meditating correctly. This is a function of the mind, and this is part of the process of meditation. And it's very necessary to allow those things to happen and allow those things to come up and pass through in order to make that connection with the self and to hear the voice, the inner voice, which is often much more quiet than the mind. And the idea is that this voice, this inner voice, this connection with the self lives in the heart space and in the belly, in the gut. So we'd like to have a little experience of that, very short guided meditation. If you will humor me for a few moments, we'll find a comfortable seat, and my guess is you're already seated if you're watching this, unless you're driving somewhere or unless you're on a walk, in which case I'd say If you really want to have this experience, maybe you pull over to the side of the road or you come back to this section when you're able to be still. Certainly there is value in moving or walking meditation, so you're more than welcome to try, but don't close your eyes, obviously, if you're behind a vehicle and or walking. But if you are seated, take a few moments to find that comfortable seat. Feel your feet on the ground. And if you want to sit on the ground, you can. Just make sure it's a comfortable seat on the ground. And start to feel your shoulders relax a little bit back, away from, kind of slumping forward like we tend to do when we're looking at a screen. So let the shoulders relax back. Let the crown of the head grow nice and tall. And if you can, let your eyes close. And just notice right away what's happening in the physical body. So where do you feel sensation in the physical body? And where is there an absence of sensation? Maybe like a numbness or an inability to feel. Are there any places that feel blocked off? And start to become aware of the breath here. You can start to think of the breath like a soothing ocean wave, kind of lulling you into this meditative state, this place of stillness. I like to think of the inhale breath as a wave receding, pulling back into the ocean. And I see the exhale breath as the wave crashing on the shore or rolling on the shore. In and out with the tide. So too is the fluctuation of the breath and the whirring of the mind. And with some practice, you might notice that there is a pattern to your own thought process. Maybe there's a particular story that you continue to tell yourself. Maybe it is an old story, perhaps from childhood. And perhaps this story is even in someone else's voice, like a parent or a friend or a teacher. And just the ability to acknowledge these voices and these stories is a very healing step in the direction of connecting with the soul voice that lives in the heart and the belly. And you might just take a moment to ask yourself here, in this safe place where you're seated, just listening to the sound of your breath, if you could create a new story, a hopeful and uplifting story for yourself, and the voice of the wise one that lives within, what would the central theme or message be? Just take a few moments of silence here to acknowledge what comes up without judgment, just noticing. As you're ready, start to bring your awareness back to the body, back to the breath, this current time and place that you occupy. Letting your chin bow into your chest. Just taking a brief moment to join the hands at the heart and honor the effort and the practice. Honoring the voice within. Blinking the eyes open, taking in the space around you, the colors, textures, temperature against your skin. And we'll come back now to our chat and kind of reflect on that experience. And if anything came up for you, I highly recommend writing it down. If there was a strong message or a strong voice, and even a soft message or kind of an inkling or a kernel of an idea, writing that down too. I will bring you back to my slides briefly because I want to point out a few questions, a few key questions that are helpful in answering those questions for ourselves, and that they often take a lot of time to unpack. And these are central thematic questions of the yoga tradition that the ancient yogis have been asking since 5,000 years ago. So, number 1, where did I come from? Number 2, who am I beyond the obvious identifications? And that is obviously, when I say obvious identifications, I mean beyond I'm Tessa, that's my name, that's the name that my parents gave me. I am a woman, I am a yoga teacher, I'm a health coach, I'm a writer, I am a sister, I am a daughter, I am a wife, a partner. So beyond those obvious identifications, what else, if you were to take it one layer deeper, what else is there that you identify as? And then now that I'm here and I've unpacked that a little bit, this person that I identify with, what is it that I believe my purpose to be? What do we think happens after we die? There's a lot of different theories and religious and spiritual beliefs depending on your own belief, and I'm certainly not here to tell you that any of those are wrong. I think there's space for all of those to be true for each of you. Whatever you resonate with and whatever you believe with is true for you. So, but I think it's worth taking the time to, again, setting aside a pause here. Feel free to pause the video and journaling about this, and or setting aside some time in your day to pontificate on these, get it out on paper a little bit. So that's a helpful step in the process of finding that inner voice and that connection to the true you, the inner soul, peeling back those layers of identifications. Next, I want to talk a little bit about, so I mentioned that yoga is a spirituality, it's a philosophy, it's a practice that believes that there are many different pathways to this goal of being your best self, self-actualization or self-realization. And the Bhagavad Gita is a story, which I love story, by the way, so I really resonate with this idea that within story we can learn so much about ourselves, and we can really travel the world and share in something bigger than ourselves. So the Bhagavad Gita is a story about Arjuna, who is a young warrior who is in the midst of battle. And this is a battle that is ripe with feeling like he doesn't know what side to take. He doesn't know whether to fight, and he doesn't know whether to not fight. And that is because this war that is being waged is against his family. So he's being asked to go to war with cousins and brothers and uncles and people that he's grown up with from childhood. So he has this internal struggle, this internal battle of, well, what is right? My duty as a warrior, my duty to my country and politics. Is this my dharma? Is this my path? Or is it to make amends with my family? And is not killing, not harming more important? And of course, this is a metaphor. It's not meant to be a literal story, but his Arjuna's chariot driver, his name is Krishna, and Krishna in the midst of battle reveals himself to be a spiritual being, a spiritual guide. And then in the midst of this battle that's kind of like paused all around them, they begin to have this conversation about discernment, right or wrong, which path to take. And not necessarily right or wrong, like Krishna's not saying, Arjuna, this is the path you have to take. Krishna is saying, Arjuna, there are many different ways, and here are some of the ways to help you discern which direction to go. And so it's a metaphor for our practice of yoga. And they talk about bhakti, which is this path of devotion and worship. And you might think of like the monks committing their life to, or a nun committing their life to kind of these austere measures like celibacy and asceticism that is devoted to this one idea of a deity or a god, or a sense of loving, faithful devotion. So bhakti is one way to work on that path of yoga towards your highest good. And then there's another of karma, which I think is so, I love talking about this because I think karma is such a misunderstood concept. You know, the idea that for every action there is a consequence, and I believe that's true, and I believe that is an aspect of what we're saying here. But more importantly, on the path of yoga, this idea of action and or service. So you might think of somebody like Mother Teresa, who was committed to a path of karma yoga and in the way of service. So her action was providing service to those in need without being attached to the outcome. It's not like she started on that path, Mother Teresa, to become this famous healer, right? This was a calling to her. And so the idea of having that action to move towards a particular goal without being attached to the outcome or the fruits of the labor. So karma is as a much bigger concept than I think we give it credit for, and a specific path in yoga. And then jhana, or sometimes referred to as buddhi yoga, is a little bit more of the scientific or intellectual realm or path of yoga, which is this study of knowledge and a collection of wisdom. So you might think about a theologist who is studying the sacred text and who is really kind of making their world and their experience like a laboratory for discerning what is true based on these particular methods of testing, of trial and error, thereby gaining knowledge and wisdom. And these concepts are really beautifully, poetically outlined in the book, the Bhagavad Gita, which, like I said, it's a story, in essence, of this warrior trying to decide, how do I choose between fighting my family and doing my duty as a warrior? So being in between a rock and a hard place, which I think is so applicable in our everyday lives, and it's a story that transcends time. So not only are there those three pathways towards self-actualization or self-realization, but there was a fourth that Patanjali, which is a sage, a famous sage, that really systematized the practice of yoga. Before the system that Patanjali put in place in a book he wrote called, he or she, we don't really know what the gender is of this figure, he systematized this fourth path called Raja Yoga. Raja means royal. And within it, created these 8 limbs of yoga, or maybe didn't create them, but wrote them down on paper in this systematic, very process-oriented way. And I shared this in a lecture not too long ago, this image of the 8 limbs of yoga, which is also referred to as Ashtanga. And it's basically like another, hey, so if bhakti, if devotion, if jhana, karma, if the third one I'm having a complete brain fart on, wow, knowledge and wisdom don't resonate with you, well then here's this fourth path. And this is really where we started to see the more asana-based practices develop. Out of this came the practice of Tantra. Out of this came the practice of, like I said, Ashtanga, which is also a physical practice. It's also a very specific physical set of postures, and Hatha and Vinyasa. And so what Patanjali laid out for us isn't, again, it's not a hard and fast rule of right or wrong. It's, here is another pathway to this goal of enlightenment, or this goal of self-realization. And it's not meant to be a linear path. It's not meant to be, okay, check, I've got 1, check, I've got 2, okay, now I can move on to postures 3. But really more of things that all work together to create this greater whole, to create this wholer experience of yourself. So I like this depiction of it as a sunburst, because I think it helps us understand that we really need to pull from all of these, and maybe sometimes we're struggling more with the yamas, which are the social ethics. Certainly right now, I think we're really experiencing that in our current day reality. And how do we pull from the niyamas to help us with a time like this, where kindness seems maybe sometimes a little bit left behind, and truthfulness, when we're thinking about heading into an election season, feels like, how do we trust the news, or how do we trust a particular politician perhaps? So then there's these practices of contentment and self-study and surrender to help us along the way. And the practice of postures, asana, to help us ground and get out some of that frenetic energy, so that we can have this practice of sitting and meditating and have that experience of connecting to the self, to the deeper self, to the soul, to the heart and the belly. So Raja Yoga, as outlined by Patanjali in his Yoga Sutras, and in particular the 8 limbs of yoga, sometimes referred to as Ashtanga, is just another way to explore. And so with that, I mean, I've given you a few different definitions of what yoga is here to do. Like, why is there this practice and this system of yoga? What is that philosophy and understanding about? And how does it make sense to you? So, this is another journaling exercise that I'd highly recommend that you either pause the video now and make a note in your journal, or a mental note in your head to come back to this at a particular time. Or perhaps that answer is already there for you. Perhaps it just, comes up and makes itself known. But I think it's worth asking and worth taking some time to not just take yoga at its face value. Whatever your experience with it is, if it's just on the mat, why do you continue to come back to your mat? And what is it about those postures that draws you back each time? Is it a particular teacher? Is it a particular style? And how does that translate beyond the mat, right? Like, certainly we do this practice because, it feels good in the body. It helps us stretch. And but I think it's worth exploring if there's something beyond that we're able to expound upon and share with those around us, and take off of our mat, off of our specific practice, into the real world when things do get tough and challenging. So worthwhile to explore this question of what yoga means to you. And, for me, if I were going to answer this question, it's so many things. The word yoga, the etymology, means to yoke or to use. Use is this ancient word of yoking an oxen to whatever it's going to be pulling. So when I think about this word yoga, to yoke, to bring two things together, I think of creating that balance and creating that synergy between what my head experiences and thinks and what my heart tells me and wants. So I think of this idea of bringing these two, sometimes it feels like disparate parts of myself, together and creating this sense of wholeness. So I really love this this practice of mudra. Mudra means to seal, and there's a lot of different hand gestures that are meant to invoke a certain energetic feel. And there's a particular mudra that is probably my favorite, and it's probably one of the most widely known, which is called Jnana Mudra. And you take your index finger and your thumb and you press them together. So just doing this is Jnana Mudra. And in this mudra, the index finger symbolizes the individual self. So I kind of think of this as the ego, the thinking mind, the person inside of me that says, I'm an individual and it's all for one and one for, it's all for one, basically, the ego says, right? I'm out for myself and screw everybody else, nobody matters, which I can get caught up in that trap too. And then there's the thumb, which is meant to symbolize the universal self, this collective consciousness, the idea that we are all in this together and that my particle matter is the same particle matter that you were made from, that I am you, that he is she, that we are all together. So the mudra, when you put your index finger and your thumb together, symbolizes the union of these two disparate parts of ourselves that are not really disparate at all, that we are all together. It's just such a nice, tangible reminder for me to just take a step back and recognize that the work that I'm doing and the way that I show up affects everyone around me, and that we are not immune to this collective human experience, that we are very much dependent on each other, and it's important to recognize that. All right, so lastly, I just want to point out some resources that I find really helpful on my journey of studying. I find it so helpful to continue to, I like to pull from each one of those practices, right? Each one of those paths of yoga. I like to pull from let me go back. I like to pull from the practice of self-study, of wisdom and knowledge. I like to pull from the practice of karma, action and renunciation. I like to pull from the practice of having a sense of spirituality and worship and connection to this higher thing. And I certainly rely on my physical practice, my Raja Yoga, my Ashtanga, to help keep me grounded and stable and feeling like I'm in my body and feeling healthy in my body. So one of the ways that I do that is I refer back to these texts that I've studied over time, and I think a great one to look at is a book called the Yoga Sutras, and I mentioned Patanjali, and in this he or she, I always say he, I'm not sure why, he talks about, he talks about these different pathways, these different metaphors, these different systematized practices of yoga. And it's just such a beautiful way to help me conceptualize this practice that I do and just continue to help me learn. And the Bhagavad Gita, I'm such a lover of poetry, so this is such a great metaphor. And this is the story of Arjuna and Krishna paused in the middle of that battle, getting ready to decide whether to fight or not to fight and what is his real duty. So with that said, thank you so much for tuning in today. If you have any suggestions for future yoga chats or particular pieces of philosophy that you'd like me to dive deeper into, I would love to hear from you. If this resonated with you at all, please let me know. And in the meantime, stay grounded, be well, stay healthy, be nice to yourself, and let that translate out to others. Namaste, everyone.